In the year 1900, on a spring morning when the light fell golden through a canopy of cottonwood and cedar, Eleanor Hartwell stood in the center of something impossible. Trees rose around her in every direction 20 feet tall and higher, their branches interlocking overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral, built not by human hands, but by time and stubborn will. The wind came across the North Dakota prairie the way it always had, relentless and ancient and answerable to nothing. But when it reached her trees, it softened, broke apart, became something almost gentle. The leaves trembled and whispered, and if you listened closely enough, you might have believed they were telling a story. 8 years earlier, this land had been as bare as an open palm. No trees, no birdsong, nothing but grass and wind and sky stretching to the edge of the world. There had been only the wind and a woman the whole county said would be dead before spring. This is that story. Autumn, 1892. The plains of North Dakota stretched beneath a sky the color of old pewter, and the wind carried with it the taste of something sharp and metallic, the taste of a winter that had not yet arrived but had already made its intentions known. Eleanor Hartwell stood on the porch of her farmhouse, a structure of weathered pine and hand-cut timber that Thomas had built with his own hands during their first year on the claim. She was 40 years old. Her hands were rough and calloused from work that never ended, her eyes the gray of the sky before a storm. Her frame was lean but sturdy in the way of women who had learned that the prairie did not care whether you were tired or hungry or heartbroken. It would take what it wanted regardless. The last leaves of the cottonwood saplings along the creek bed spun through the air like tiny golden coins, catching the light before settling onto earth that was already hardening in anticipation of frost. Eleanor watched them fall and thought about how everything beautiful on the prairie seemed to exist only briefly, a flash of color before the long gray silence of winter. She had been watching things disappear for 7 years now. Flowers that bloomed for a week and then were gone. Calves born strong that weakened in the cold. Neighbors who arrived with wagons full of hope and left with wagons full of what they could carry and nothing else. The prairie was a place that consumed optimism the way fire consumed dry grass, quickly and completely, and without apology. Thomas had died in April. She could still see it when she closed her eyes, and she closed her eyes more often than she should have. The plow had caught on a buried root, the kind that had no business being where it was, thick and ancient and belonging to a tree that must have stood on that spot 100 years before any settler arrived. The blade had twisted, and the whole apparatus had bucked sideways with a violence that seemed almost deliberate, as though the land itself had decided that 7 years of being cut open was enough. Thomas had been thrown forward, and then the plow had come down on top of him, pinning him against the earth he had spent those 7 years trying to tame. Eleanor had been hanging laundry when she heard Runa scream, not a whinny, not the ordinary sound a horse makes when startled, but a full-throated scream. The sound a horse makes when it knows something terrible has happened. She had dropped the wet shirt she was holding and run across the field with her skirts bunched in her fists, and the distance between the clothesline and the north field had never seemed so vast, each step covering ground that seemed to stretch ahead of her, faster than she could cross it. When she reached him, the blood was already soaking into the soil, spreading outward in a dark stain that the earth drank eagerly, as if it had been waiting for this offering all along. She had tried to lift the plow. She had planted her feet and wrapped her hands around the iron frame and pulled with everything she had, and it had not moved, not an inch. She had screamed for help, but there was no one to hear. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and the wind carried her voice in the wrong direction, scattering it across empty grass like seeds that would never take root. Thomas had taken her hand. His grip was weak but deliberate, and he had looked at her with those blue eyes she had fallen in love with in a church in Minnesota 12 years before. And he had said her name once, just her name. Then something else, his voice cracking at the edges like thin ice. 2 words she almost missed beneath the wind. The drawer. His fingers tightened once around hers, a pulse of intention, and then his hand had gone slack. She had stayed with him for a long time after that, kneeling in the dirt beside the overturned plow, holding a hand that could no longer hold hers back. Runa stood nearby, shifting her weight from hoof to hoof, making small sounds of distress that Eleanor understood perfectly, because they were the same sounds she wanted to make but could not. Because if she started, she knew she would never stop. The funeral had been small but sufficient. Neighbors came from farms scattered across miles of prairie, arriving in wagons and on horseback, bringing covered dishes and words of comfort, and something else that they carried in their eyes but never on their tongues. Pity. The particular kind of pity reserved for a woman who was now alone in a place where aloneness was not a condition but a sentence. They had stood around the grave that Gunnar Dal and two other men had dug in the hard ground behind the house, and the preacher from Millerville had said the words that preachers say, and the women had squeezed Eleanor's hands and told her Thomas was with the Lord now. The men had shaken her hand with a firmness meant to convey strength, but that actually conveyed something closer to farewell. They were saying goodbye not just to Thomas but to her, because everyone knew what happened to women alone on the prairie. They either remarried quickly, sold out and went east, or they died. There was no fourth option. After the last wagon had disappeared down the road, and the dust had settled, and the casserole dishes sat cooling on the kitchen table, Eleanor had done something she would never speak of to anyone. She had sat down in the chair across from Thomas's empty chair in the kitchen he had built at the table he had made from lumber, hauled 40 miles by wagon, and she had felt something she was immediately ashamed of. Relief. Not relief that he was dead, never that, but relief that the pretending was over. Relief that she no longer had to smile when he dismissed her ideas about the farm. Relief that she no longer had to bite her tongue when he insisted that every acre must be given to wheat and barley, that the land existed for one purpose and one purpose only, that her quiet suggestions about planting trees or building better windbreaks were the fancies of a woman who did not understand the serious business of farming. She loved Thomas. She had loved him deeply and completely, and she would carry that love like a stone in her chest for the rest of her life. But she had also lived for 7 years inside a marriage where her thoughts were tolerated, but never truly heard, where her voice existed in the same room as his, but occupied a lower register, one that could be acknowledged with a nod, and then set aside like a newspaper already read. She remembered a night the previous winter, when she had sat at this same table after Thomas had gone to bed and drawn a planting diagram on the back of an old newspaper. Rows of trees arranged in careful lines around the house, spacing calculated by intuition and common sense. Species selected from memory of what she had seen growing along riverbanks and in the sheltered hollows where the wind could not reach. She had been absorbed in it for an hour, her pencil moving with a certainty her voice never carried in Thomas's presence. And then she had heard his footsteps behind her and turned to find him standing in the doorway in his undershirt, squinting at the paper in the lamplight. He had studied it for a long moment, long enough that she felt a brief and dangerous surge of hope. Then he had spoken. "You draw well, Eleanor." Not a word about the plan itself, not a question about the spacing or the species or the reasoning behind any of it. A compliment about the lines on the paper, as if she had been sketching flowers instead of engineering salvation. She sat with the shame of her relief for a long time that evening after the funeral, until the kitchen grew dark and the food grew cold and the wind outside began to rise. 1 week after the funeral, a wagon pulled up to the gate, and Silas Pemberton stepped down from the driver's seat with the careful movements of a man who was heavier than he wanted to be and knew it. He was 55 years old, the owner of the general store in Millerville, and of several properties, besides a man whose small eyes moved constantly, taking inventory of everything they saw and assigning it a price. The way he looked at the farmhouse and the barn and the fields beyond them was the way a butcher looks at livestock, measuring weight and yield and the distance between what something is and what it could be worth to someone else. His hat came off with a gesture that was technically respectful, but somehow managed to feel like an appraisal. "Mrs. Hartwell, my deepest condolences. Thomas was a fine man." Eleanor thanked him, and waited because she could feel the transaction assembling itself behind his sympathy, the way she could feel rain assembling behind clouds. I won't take much of your time. I know you're grieving, but I wanted you to know that my offer still stands. $500 for the property, all 160 acres. It's generous, all things considered. His eyes moved across the farm, and Eleanor could see him calculating, adding columns in his head, already dividing the land into parcels and multiplying each one by the price per acre he would charge the next buyer. Her voice was steady, even though her hands, hidden in the folds of her apron, were trembling. The property is not for sale, Mr. Pemberton. Silas smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had heard the word no before and understood it as a temporary condition, a phase that winter and loneliness and arithmetic would eventually cure. Ma'am, the winter that's coming is going to be something fierce. The signs are everywhere. The beavers have built their dams higher than anyone can remember. The geese flew south 3 weeks early. My bones ache like I'm 90 years old, and I'm not a man given to exaggeration. He let the weight of his words settle over the porch like the first dusting of snow. A woman alone cannot face what's coming. Eleanor repeated that the answer was no, and she held his gaze until he put his hat back on. Then he paused as if remembering something incidental, something that had almost slipped his mind. Oh, one more thing, Mrs. Hartwell. There's the matter of the $200 Thomas borrowed from me last winter for seed. The note comes due end of June next year. I'm in no rush, of course, but paper is paper. He smiled again, touched the brim of his hat, and climbed back onto his wagon. She stood on the porch until the wagon was out of sight, watching the dust settle behind it, watching the road return to stillness. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands because the trembling had moved from her hands to her whole body, and she could not make it stop. $200. Thomas had never mentioned it. In 7 years of marriage, through all the conversations about seed and equipment and supplies, through all the careful accounting of every penny, he had never once mentioned that he owed Silas Pemberton $200. She had perhaps 300 in savings. If she paid the debt, she would have almost nothing left to survive the winter. If she did not pay, Silas would go to the county court, and the court would order her property sold at auction. And in the dead of winter, with no competing buyers, the land would sell for far less than it was worth. And Silas would be the only man standing at the auction block with cash in his hand. That evening, she did something she had been avoiding since April. She opened Thomas's desk. It was a simple thing. Pine boards and iron hinges built by the same hands that had built the table and the chairs and the house itself. Thomas had kept it locked, and Eleanor had never questioned this because there were boundaries in their marriage that both of them respected or at least observed. But Thomas was gone, and boundaries meant nothing to the dead. She took the small iron key from the nail where it hung behind the kitchen door and turned it in the lock and pulled the drawer open. The promissory note was there, just as Silas had described. Thomas's signature at the bottom, dated February 1892. $200 at 4% interest due the 30th of June, 1893. Eleanor read it twice and set it aside. Beneath the note, there was something else. A small leather notebook worn soft at the edges filled with Thomas's slanted handwriting. She opened it and began to read. And what she found inside rearranged the architecture of everything she thought she knew about the man she had married and the life they had shared. It was a plan, detailed, careful, thorough in the way that Thomas was thorough about everything he touched. Page after page of notes about trees, species that could survive the North Dakota climate. Diagrams showing how rows of trees could be arranged to break the force of the prairie wind. Notes copied from agricultural journals about experiments in Kansas and Nebraska. Measurements and calculations and small precise drawings of root systems and branch patterns that revealed not casual curiosity, but sustained private obsession. He had been studying this for years. The earliest entries were dated 1889, 3 years before his death, which meant that for 3 years he had been quietly accumulating evidence for the very idea he had dismissed when Eleanor raised it across the dinner table. On the last page in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, as if the pen had hesitated before committing the words to paper, Thomas had written, "I know the trees are the answer, but people will laugh. The land is for wheat, not for foolish dreams." Eleanor stared at those words for a very long time. The lamp on the desk flickered in a draught she could not feel, and the shadows on the wall shifted and reformed, and the house settled around her, with the small sounds that old wood makes when the temperature drops. Then she closed the notebook and held it against her chest, and the crying that came was not the crying of the funeral, not the helpless, hollow crying of grief. This was something else entirely. This was the crying of a woman who had just discovered that the man she loved had carried the same dream she carried, had seen the same answer she saw, and that both of them had been too afraid of the other's judgment to speak it aloud. They had sat across from each other at this table for 7 years, each holding a secret that was not a secret at all, but a shared conviction, and neither had found the courage to say it. The distance between them had not been disagreement. It had been fear, and fear had won, and Thomas was dead. And the trees existed only on paper. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, reading and rereading the entries tracing the evolution of Thomas's thinking, from tentative questions to confident calculations. She studied his diagrams and compared them to the ones she had drawn on the back of that newspaper, and the similarities made her chest ache with a grief more specific and more cruel than any she had felt at the graveside. They had been designing the same windbreak, independently, secretly in parallel, like two people writing letters to each other that neither one ever sent. The next morning, she saddled Runa, the chestnut mare that had been Thomas's pride, and she rode to Millerville. The air was sharp enough to bite, and the wagon track was rutted deep from the wheels of dozens of vehicles that had passed before her. Millerville was not much of a town. A dozen wooden buildings clustered around a railroad station like calves around a mother cow. But it was the center of commerce for settlers scattered across miles of empty grass, and it held within its modest borders the one thing Eleanor needed more than supplies or sympathy. The forestry office was a single room at the back of the land claims building, and the man who occupied it looked as if he had been waiting a long time for someone to walk through the door. Orrin Munsell was perhaps 60, with a gray beard that reached his chest and eyes that were simultaneously kind and weary. The eyes of a man who had spent 5 years trying to convince people of something they did not want to hear. He had come to Dakota as part of a government program to promote tree planting on the Great Plains, and the results thus far had been, by his own admission, discouraging. Farmers listened politely and then went back to their wheat. The prairie had taught them to trust only what they could see, and they could not see the wind being broken by trees that did not yet exist. He rose from his chair when Eleanor entered and offered condolences for Thomas that were brief and genuine, the kind that come from a man who means what he says and sees no reason to say more. Eleanor spread her hand-drawn map across his desk, and then, after a moment's hesitation that lasted long enough for her to feel the full weight of what she was about to do, she placed Thomas's notebook beside it. "My husband planned this before I did. I want to finish what he started." Orrin picked up the notebook and read, slowly turning the pages with the care of a man handling something precious. His fingers paused on the diagrams. He went back and reread certain passages. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with something Eleanor had not expected to find in a government office in a town at the edge of the world: recognition. "Your husband understood something that most farmers out here refuse to accept." His voice was quiet, with the particular quietness of a man delivering a truth he has delivered many times to empty rooms. "The wind is the problem. Everything else, the snowdrifts, the frozen livestock, the houses that can't hold heat, all of it comes back to the wind." He stood and moved to a large chart pinned to the wall, a cross-section diagram showing rows of trees arranged in a specific pattern. and he explained the mechanics with the contained excitement of a teacher who has finally found a student willing to learn. A windbreak worked by disrupting the laminar flow of wind across flat terrain. Multiple rows of trees at calculated distances from the structures to be protected created zones of reduced velocity. The trees did not stop the wind. Nothing could stop the wind, but they broke. Its force slowed it down, redirected it upward. Snow, instead of piling into massive drifts against walls, got distributed more evenly across a wider area. Temperature on the sheltered side could be several degrees warmer. Soil retained more moisture because the wind was no longer stripping it away. He turned back to Eleanor's map and studied it with the notebook open beside it, cross-referencing Thomas's calculations with the property layout. For a windbreak of this scale, you'd need at least 300 saplings. Cottonwood for fast growth, American elm for hardiness, red cedar to hold their needles through winter and provide year-round protection. Green ash because they can tolerate the constant wind better than almost anything else. He paused, then choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who had seen enthusiasm destroyed by reality too many times to be careless with encouragement. The cost would be considerable, and the work. This would be a project of several years, a decade before the trees are fully effective. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, as if it had been waiting inside her for 7 years and needed only this moment to emerge. Then I had better start now. Orrin looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled. And Eleanor realized it was the first genuine smile she had seen directed at her since Thomas's death. Not a smile of pity or condescension, but the smile of a man who had just found something he had been searching for across 5 years of empty rooms and polite refusals. An ally. 2 weeks later, while Eleanor was driving stakes into the ground to mark planting positions, measuring the distances between them, with the length of rope she had knotted at precise intervals, a carriage she did not recognize pulled up to the gate. The woman who stepped down was younger than Eleanor, perhaps 35, dressed in city clothes that looked expensive and impractical, and entirely wrong for the North Dakota wind. She had Thomas's blue eyes. Vivian Hartwell, Thomas's younger sister. They had met only twice before at the wedding, and at a Christmas gathering in St. Paul 3 years ago. Vivian had never visited the farm, had never expressed the slightest interest in the life her brother had chosen, and her presence now felt less like a family visit and more like an opening move in a game whose rules Eleanor did not yet know. "I've come about the property." The directness at least had the virtue of honesty, and Eleanor respected honesty even when it arrived wearing clothes unsuited to the climate. "Thomas was my only brother. I believe I have a right to a share of his estate." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the chairs that Eleanor and Thomas had occupied for 7 years of meals and silences and conversations that never quite reached the things that mattered most. The lamp between them threw long shadows across the walls, and the shadows moved when the flame moved, and the whole room felt as though it were breathing. Vivian's case was simple and delivered with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed it on the train. The land should be sold, the proceeds divided. Eleanor could go back east, start over somewhere civilized. And Vivian needed the money. Things in St. Paul had not been kind. Eleanor reached across the table and picked up Thomas's notebook. She opened it to the page with the planting diagram and turned it so Vivian could see. "Your brother dreamed of this. He researched it, planned it, drew every detail. But he never did it because he was afraid people would laugh. I'm going to do it for him." Vivian stared at the notebook, then at Eleanor, then back at the notebook. "Trees. You're staying on this godforsaken prairie for trees." Thomas wanted exactly this. He just never told anyone, not even me. Something shifted in Vivian's expression. A fracture in the certainty she had carried through the door. The momentary softening of someone encountering evidence that contradicts a conclusion they have already reached. But the fracture sealed over, quickly mortared shut by need, and the particular stubbornness of people who have traveled a long way to get what they came for. I'll be speaking to a lawyer." She stood and walked out without touching the coffee Eleanor had poured for her, and the door closed behind her, with a sound that was quieter than a slam, but louder than a simple closing, occupying the precise middle ground between departure and threat. Eleanor sat alone at the table for a long time after Vivian left. She looked at Thomas's empty chair and felt the loneliness settle over her, like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders and chest, until breathing required conscious effort. But beneath the loneliness there was a question she could not silence. A question Vivian's visit had planted like a seed in soil she would rather have left undisturbed. Was she doing this for Thomas or for herself? Was the notebook a reason or an excuse? If Thomas had never written those pages, would she still be driving stakes into the ground? Still planning to spend her dead husband's savings on 300 trees that every neighbor within 10 miles thought were a waste of time and money? She did not have an answer that night. She picked up the notebook and held it and looked at Thomas's handwriting and tried to find him in the curves of the letters. And she could not, because he was gone, and the dead do not explain themselves, and the living are left to assign meaning to marks on paper that might mean everything or might mean nothing at all. She slept badly, waking twice to the sound of the wind, and once to a silence so complete that she sat up in bed, convinced that time itself had stopped. In the gray hour before dawn, she rose and dressed, and went out to the porch and stood in the cold dark and looked at the stakes she had driven into the ground. They stood in their rows, pale and thin against the black earth, marking the places where trees would go, where roots would grip, and trunks would rise and branches would spread, and a wall of living wood would stand between her and the wind that had been trying to drive her away since the day she arrived. She counted the stakes. She counted them again, and in the counting she found something that was not quite an answer, but was close enough to let her pick up the spade when the sun came up. It did not matter whether she was doing this for Thomas or for herself. It mattered that it was being done. The saplings arrived by rail from nurseries in Minnesota during the third week of October, packed in damp straw inside wooden crates that smelled of earth and distance and the faint sweetness of new growth. Eleanor was waiting at the Millerville station when the train pulled in, standing on the platform, with Runa hitched to the wagon behind her. And she loaded the crates onto the flatbed with a tenderness that the station master found peculiar. He watched her adjust their positions, angling them to keep the wind from drying the straw during the ride home, and he mentioned it to his wife that evening over dinner. His wife mentioned it to a neighbor. By the following morning, half the county knew that the Hartwell widow was hauling trees home from the railroad like a woman bringing babies from the orphanage. She began planting immediately. Each morning found her in the field before the sun was fully up, digging holes with a spade that raised blisters on her palms, and then broke the blisters and then raised new ones on top of the raw skin beneath. The work was brutal and monotonous. A rhythm of dig and place and fill and tamp, repeated hundreds of times across days that grew shorter and colder with each passing week. She developed a system born of necessity and refined by repetition. She would dig 5 holes in a row, spacing them by the length of the spade handle plus 2 hand widths, then return to the first hole and plant, then water from the bucket. She carried on her hip, then moved to the next. The repetition gave her mind room to wander, and it wandered always to the same places. To Thomas and the notebook, and the question of whether she was honoring his dream or using it as armor against the advice of people who might be right. She learned things that no manual could teach her, that the soil in the low ground near the creek held moisture differently than the soil on the slight rise behind the barn, that the angle of a sapling in the hole mattered, because a tree planted even slightly crooked would grow crooked, and a crooked tree caught the wind wrong and would break where a straight one would bend. She learned to read the roots the way she had once read Thomas's handwriting, looking for signs of health and distress in the fine white tendrils that spread through the soil like veins through a hand. The neighbors noticed. Wagons slowed as they passed her property. Faces turned, fingers pointed. Voices carried on the wind in fragments she caught and tried to ignore. She was aware of being watched, being discussed, being weighed and measured, by people whose opinions she had once valued and whose judgment she now had to endure without the shield of a husband's presence to deflect it. Gunnar Dahl was the first to say it directly. He was Eleanor's nearest neighbor to the east, a large man with hands like shovels and opinions he delivered with the subtlety of a hammer. He stood at the barbed wire fence that separated their properties and shouted across while Eleanor worked under the midday sun, her back aching and her fingers raw, and the sweat on her forehead turning cold in the autumn air, almost as fast as it appeared. Eleanor, what in God's name are you doing? Those trees are going to steal every nutrient from the soil. Thomas would be rolling in his grave. She stopped digging, leaned on her spade, wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Thomas isn't here, Gunnar, and these trees are going to protect my house when winter comes. Protect. Gunnar laughed, a big booming sound that rolled across the prairie like distant thunder and arrived at Eleanor's ears carrying the full weight of a man's certainty that the world worked exactly the way he understood it, and no other way was possible. Those little sticks couldn't stop a summer breeze, let alone a Dakota winter wind. What you need is a husband who knows how to prepare a house for winter, not somebody playing at gardening. Eleanor did not respond. She turned back to her work and drove the spade into the earth and kept digging, and the blade bit into soil that was getting harder each day as the frost crept deeper, and each hole she carved felt like a word in an argument she was making with the ground itself. After a while, Gunnar shook his head and walked away, and the sound of his laughter hung in the air long after he was gone, settling over her like a second skin she would wear for the rest of the season, whether she wanted to or not. That night, Eleanor sat in her kitchen by the unsteady light of a kerosene lamp, her hands raw and throbbing, studying the forestry manual that Orrin had lent her. The pages were full of technical diagrams and growth tables information. She absorbed with the focused hunger of someone teaching themselves to swim in water that is already over their head. But what held her attention longest were the photographs. Black and white images of mature windbreaks in Kansas and Nebraska. Rows of trees 30 feet tall forming green walls against the endless horizon. And behind them, houses sheltered and protected, nestled in the lee of the trees like chicks beneath a mother's wings. She looked up from the book and stared at Thomas's portrait on the wall. "Do you believe in me?" she whispered. The house answered with silence, and the wind pressing against the walls, testing the windows, searching for a way in. She looked back at the photographs. Then she closed the manual and stood and walked outside and looked at the rows of stakes shining faintly in the moonlight. Each one a promise she had made to a dead man and to herself. And she could not tell which promise weighed more. And it did not matter, because they were both made of the same material. Tomorrow she would plant more trees, and the day after that, and the day after that, until it was done or she was. The first snow came early that year in the first week of November, when Eleanor had planted only half her 300 saplings. The flakes were large and wet, the kind that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful, treacherous. When she stepped onto the porch that morning, with a cup of coffee steaming in her hands, she saw her young trees for the first time in white. Small sentinels standing in their rows, each one wearing a cap of snow that made them look both more fragile and more determined than they had the day before. Berta Holgrim stopped her wagon on the road to stare. She was the blacksmith's wife, 45 years old, a woman of practical disposition and reliable pessimism, whose face arranged itself into doubt, the way other faces arrange themselves into smiles. They'll all be dead after the first hard freeze. Young trees can't survive a first winter without serious protection. My father tried something like this in Iowa 20 years ago. Not one left standing by spring. Eleanor said nothing because she had already read about this in Orrin's manual, and because she had learned long ago that the most effective response to a prediction of failure was not argument, but action. During the following days, she worked from dawn until her fingers would no longer close, wrapping the thinnest trunks in burlap and building small wooden frames to shield the most vulnerable crowns. Each tree she wrapped required kneeling in soil that was colder each morning, threading coarse fabric around trunks no thicker than her wrist, tying knots with fingers that had lost feeling hours ago. It was meticulous, exhausting work, but each tree she finished felt like a small victory against forces both meteorological and human that seemed determined to drive her from the land. She finished protecting the last tree on a day when the temperature dropped so sharply that the water in the horse trough froze solid between noon and sunset, a 6-hour window in which the world transitioned from autumn to something that was not yet winter, but was no longer anything else. She stood on her porch and looked out at her work. 300 young trees standing in rows like an army of children wrapped in burlap against the coming cold. And she felt something she had not expected to feel: pride. Not the loud, boastful kind that announces itself and demands recognition, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in the chest and asks nothing of anyone, and is therefore the only kind that endures. The wind picked up that evening, driving hard from the northwest, carrying the smell of ice and distance, and things that had no names. Somewhere in Millerville, Silas Pemberton sat in the warm back room of his store, the promissory note for $200 folded neatly in his vest pocket, looking out the window toward the darkness where Eleanor Hartwell's farm sat invisible beyond the horizon. He was a patient man. Winter was coming, and winter, in his experience, had a way of simplifying even the most stubborn woman's arithmetic. And in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a lawyer's office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, Vivian Hartwell signed her name at the bottom of a document that would force a hearing on the division of her dead brother's estate. The pen moved across the paper with the determined pressure of a woman spending her last reserves of courage on a single act. And when it was done, she sat back in the chair and stared at her signature and felt nothing that resembled certainty. Eleanor knew nothing of these things. She stood on her porch with her blistered hands wrapped in cloth and her coffee growing cold, and the first real wind of winter howling down from the north, flattening the grass beyond her tree rows and driving snow horizontally past the house in white streaks that looked like scratches on the surface of the dark. She knew only this: she had bet everything she had on 300 small trees that the wind could snap like matchsticks, a debt she could not afford to pay, and a dead man's dream written in a leather notebook that she carried against her body like a talisman against the certainty of everyone around her that she had already lost. The prairie stretched away from her in every direction, vast and dark and indifferent. The winter was coming, and she was alone. The sound that woke Eleanor Hartwell on the second Tuesday of December was not wind. She had lived with wind for 7 years and knew all its voices: the low, steady moan of an ordinary blow, the high keening of a gale off the northern flats, the sudden percussive gusts that slammed against the house like fists and rattled every window in its frame. This was different. This was the sound of the atmosphere tearing itself apart, a sustained freight train roar that vibrated through the floorboards and shook dust from the ceiling rafters, and told her in the wordless language the prairie speaks to those who have learned to listen, that something extraordinary and merciless had arrived. She dressed in the dark, 3 layers wool over cotton over flannel fingers stiff with cold as she buttoned each one. When she pressed her face to the kitchen window, she saw nothing but a solid wall of white moving sideways past the glass at a speed that made individual snowflakes invisible. The world beyond the house had been erased. The blizzard held for 3 days. Eleanor fed the cast-iron stove with the discipline of a soldier rationing ammunition, understanding that each log represented a specific number of hours, and that the pile beside the door was not infinite, and that the difference between enough and not enough was a matter of arithmetic, not will. She ate cold beans from a jar and bread she had baked the week before, already going hard at the edges. She melted snow for water, opening the front door just far enough to scoop a bucketful before the wind forced it shut again, with a violence that nearly took her fingers. She slept upright in the kitchen chair with a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, Because the bedroom was an expedition, she could not afford the hallway. Between the two rooms, a corridor of cold that belonged to the storm and not to her. On the second night, the not knowing became unbearable. She had to see the trees. She had to touch them, confirm their existence in the howling dark. Because lying in the kitchen listening to the storm dismantle the world outside, she had begun to believe that everything she had built was already gone. That the wind had plucked her saplings from the frozen ground the way a child pulls weeds and flung them across the empty miles, and there was nothing left but stumps and snow and the particular silence that follows total erasure. She put on Thomas's heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around her head until only her eyes showed, tied one end of a rope to the porch post and gripped the other end, and stepped into the storm. The force of it staggered her immediately. She went down to her hands and knees on the porch boards and stayed there because the wind at standing height was not something a human body could oppose. The snow drove sideways with such velocity that it peppered her exposed skin like thrown sand, and visibility was measured in inches. She crawled off the porch and onto the frozen ground, feeding the rope through her gloved hands, counting knots she had tied at intervals to measure distance. Her right hand found the first trunk. Through the burlap wrapping, she could feel the wood rigid and cold and unmistakably present. She pressed her forehead against it and felt the solidity of it push back against her skull. And for a moment, the storm receded to a distant roar, and there was nothing in the world except this small circle of contact between her skin and the tree she had planted. Then she moved to the next, and the next, hand over hand along the row, verifying each one by touch because her eyes were useless, because in this storm sight was a luxury the Prairie had revoked. She was 10 trees in when she realized she was crying. The tears froze immediately, tightening the skin around her eyes into a mask that cracked when she blinked. She understood in a distant clinical way that her fingers had stopped hurting, which meant the cold had moved past warning and into the territory of damage. She found the rope by feel and followed it back hand over hand, each knot a station on a journey she was no longer certain she would complete. When she fell through the kitchen door and kicked it shut, she lay on the floor for what felt like a very long time, her body shaking with a violence that was beyond her control, her teeth cracking against each other in a rhythm that matched nothing. But the trees were standing. When the storm broke on the third morning, and Eleanor waded through waist-deep snow to inspect the damage she found. Two things. The first was expected. The barn had lost several roof planks, and the north wall of the house was buried under a drift taller than she was, a white cliff face that would take days to excavate. The second was not expected at all. On the lee side of her tree rows, the drifts were measurably smaller than on the exposed side. The difference was modest, a few inches at most, the kind of thing a person would miss if they were not looking for it specifically. But Eleanor had been looking for it since the day she drove the first stake into the ground. She knelt in the snow and pressed her palms flat against the frozen earth and closed her eyes. The proof was small, and the winter was young, and the trees were barely more than sticks wrapped in cloth. But the principle was sound. The wind had met resistance and had been forced to negotiate. And the snow behind the resistance was less than the snow in front of it. Physics did not require faith. It required only obstruction. 4 days later, she found Silas Pemberton's letter in her mailbox. The handwriting was meticulous, every letter formed with the precision of a man who believed that penmanship reflected character. $600 for the property. The offer expired at month's end. The note for $200 came due end of June. He preferred not to involve the courts. Eleanor read the letter standing in the cold wind beside the mailbox, the paper snapping in her fingers like a small trapped animal. She carried it inside, lifted the stove lid, and dropped it into the coals. The paper flared bright orange, curled into ash, and vanished. But the heat from the fire could not stop the trembling in her hands. Because destroying a letter did not destroy a debt, and the deadline was real, and the money was not. The winter deepened. Temperatures fell to 40 below, and stayed there week after week, locking the prairie under a regime of cold so absolute that metal burned bare skin on contact, and the air itself seemed to crystallize each breath, a small cloud that froze before it fully left the mouth. Three families packed their wagons and headed east, their departures marked by the creak of frozen axles and the silence of people who have been defeated by something too large to name. Two elderly settlers on claims north of Millerville froze to death in houses whose firewood had been exhausted, found by neighbors days later. In rooms that had become chambers of ice, their bodies positioned in attitudes of ordinary life, one still sitting in a chair, as if waiting for warmth to return. Eleanor endured. She had planned her supplies with precision, and she had enough of everything except company. The isolation settled over her in layers each day, adding another coat of silence until she could feel its weight on her shoulders and chest, as a physical burden that no amount of firewood could lighten. She found herself talking to Runa in the barn. Not the brief practical words a farmer uses with livestock, but sustained monologues about soil chemistry and root depth and the thermal conductivity of different tree species lectures delivered to an audience of one horse who listened with the patience of an animal that understood nothing of the words but everything of the need behind them. One evening, Eleanor stopped mid-sentence, a bucket of oats suspended between the feed bin and the trough, and heard herself from the outside. She was standing alone in a frozen barn, explaining the relationship between wind velocity and snow deposition to a horse. She set the bucket down carefully and walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and placed her hands flat on the wood and held very still. What she felt was not sadness or self-pity. It was a fear she had not encountered before, specific and clinical and new. The fear of a mind beginning to fold inward upon itself for lack of anything external to hold on to. She was not losing her sanity. She was watching it thin the way ice thins at the edges of a pond in early spring, still solid at the center, but developing translucencies at the margins that would widen if nothing changed. Between midnight and the 1 o'clock that same night, she heard knocking. 3 raps, deliberate and evenly spaced, each one distinct from the wind and the creaking of the house and every other sound the storm made. She took Thomas's shotgun from its place beside the door and opened it with the barrel pointed at the darkness beyond the threshold. The porch was empty, but on the top step, already collecting snow, sat a woven basket covered with a linen cloth. Inside she found a loaf of bread that still held the ghost of warmth from the oven, a jar of rendered lard and a coil of new rope. She looked out at the road and saw faint tracks nearly erased by the blowing snow, and the wheel ruts were narrow the width of a light buggy, the kind driven by a woman. She brought the basket inside and set it on the table and stood over it for a long time, the shotgun still in her left hand and the bread in her right. And the contrast between the two objects seemed to contain everything she needed to know about what her life had become. She put the gun down. She tore off a piece of bread and ate it standing at the kitchen window, watching the snow fall through the darkness and the taste of it. The taste of someone else's care arriving anonymously and without obligation in the deepest cold she had ever known. Reached past every defense she had built and touched something she had been protecting so fiercely that she had forgotten it was there. She was not alone. Someone out there in the killing dark had thought of her, and the thinking had taken physical form, and the form was bread, and the bread was still warm. February arrived with another storm. 4 days without respite, the longest sustained assault any settler in the county could recall. When it spent itself and the silence returned with the sudden totality of a held breath, released Eleanor walked out to tend the livestock and found Gunnar Dahl standing by the barn. His face had changed since autumn. The ruddy confidence was gone, replaced by something gray, and drawn the face of a man who has watched the world take something from him that he cannot get back. Lost 8 head. The words came without greeting or preamble, stripped of everything except the fact they carried. Froze standing in the north pasture. Couldn't reach them. He turned his head toward Eleanor's tree rows, now nearly 2 feet above the snow line, and studied them with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not skepticism, not mockery, hunger. The raw, undisguised hunger of a man looking at something he needs and does not have and cannot acquire through any of the methods he has always relied upon. "The wind around your place?" He spoke slowly, as if each word required individual permission. "It's different, weaker. I can feel it when I cross onto your property. Those trees are doing that." "They are." He was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as though chewing something he did not want to swallow. "I owe you an apology. For what I said about Thomas. For all of it." Eleanor nodded. Some debts are settled in the silence after the words, not in the words themselves. Gunnar left. But the next afternoon, he appeared at the fence with a shovel and dug planting holes for 2 hours without speaking. When he finished, he nodded once and walked home. He came back the next day and the day after that, and each time he said nothing, and each time the silence between them grew more comfortable, evolving from the absence of conversation into something more purposeful, a shared language composed entirely of labor and the sounds of tools entering frozen earth. Spring came in late March with a reluctance that felt personal. The season dragging its feet like a witness approaching a stand it would rather avoid. But when the snow released its hold on the land, what it revealed made Orrin Munsell drive out from town and walk the tree rows with his notebook open, stopping every few paces to measure trunk diameter and crown height and record numbers that made his pen move faster than his feet. 95%. His voice carried the stunned precision of a man whose profession requires him to quantify miracles. "Under these conditions, I would have expected to lose half. This is something, Mrs. Hartwell. This is genuinely something." Eleanor allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. A single breath drawn deeper than the others held, longer released with the conscious knowledge that she had earned the air it contained. Then she asked about the replanting schedule for the gaps where saplings had failed, because the gaps were vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities were invitations, and the wind did not need to be invited twice. She spent the spring months filling the empty spaces and tending the survivors with a vigilance that bordered on the clinical. She checked each tree daily, examining bark for disease testing. Soil moisture with her fingers, adjusting support stakes when wind loosened them. The debt to Silas sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe present with every step. She managed to set aside $30 from the sale of her winter wheat, and she knew it would not be enough. Summer came, and with it catastrophe. July of 1893 was the driest month anyone in North Dakota could remember. The grass that had been green in June turned the color of old straw, and the soil cracked open in patterns that looked like the palm of an ancient hand reading its own fortune and finding nothing good. Every farmer in the county watched the sky for rain and saw nothing but a dome of polished brass, cloudless and merciless and impossibly wide. Eleanor was carrying water to the west row bucket by bucket from a well that was dropping lower each day when the wind changed direction, and she tasted something on the air that made every muscle in her body lock rigid. Smoke. Not the thin domestic smoke of a cook stove or a fireplace. Something vast and hungry and moving fast, the exhalation of something that had no lungs and no mercy and no capacity to distinguish between grass and timber and human ambition. She climbed onto the top rail of the fence and looked west, and what she saw emptied her mind of every thought except one. A wall of dark smoke stretched across the entire western horizon, and beneath it, visible at a distance of perhaps 2 miles, and closing was a band of light the color of a dying sun, except that this light was moving across the ground and consuming everything it touched. Prairie fire. The one thing no amount of planning could prepare for. Fire on dry grass traveled faster than a galloping horse, and it did not stop for fences or buildings or dreams written in leather notebooks. She did not run for help. There was no time, and there was no one close enough to reach. She ran to the barn and grabbed every burlap sack she could carry. and plunged them into the water trough. She seized her spade and began cutting a fire break along the western boundary of her tree rows, carving a trench of bare earth between the approaching flames and the trees she had spent a year planting and protecting, and rapping against the cold and checking each morning for signs of life. The spade bit into baked ground that resisted every stroke, as though the earth itself had taken the side of the fire. The heat grew, the smoke thickened until she was coughing with every breath, and her eyes were streaming, and the light in the west was no longer a distant glow, but a present and overwhelming reality. A wall of flame taller than a man advancing through the dry grass, with a sound that was less like fire and more like a living thing breathing in huge, ragged gasps. She beat at the leading edge with soaked burlap, swinging with both arms, until her shoulders screamed, and the muscles in her back seized and released and seized again. The fire hissed and retreated, and then surged around the edges and came at her from a new angle, as if it were thinking, as if it were learning. She did not notice when the burlap in her right hand caught fire. She did not feel it until the flames reached her skin. Even then she kept swinging, because stopping meant the trees would burn. And the trees burning meant everything burned: the plan and the notebook, and the proof that physics worked, and the year of blisters, and the pride she had felt on the porch, watching her small army stand in the snow. She kept swinging until Gunnar arrived at a gallop. His horse lathered and wild-eyed, and grabbed a shovel from the barn without slowing, and threw himself into the line beside her, widening the fire break where her trench was too narrow, beating at spot fires that jumped the gap. They worked without speaking, two bodies performing a single act of desperate choreography, and the fire pressed and retreated and pressed again, and the smoke rolled over them in waves that blotted out the sky and replaced it with something darker and closer and more intimate than any night. By nightfall, the wind had shifted east, and the fire, finding nothing left to consume on the cleared ground, bent away from the farm and raced on across the open prairie toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. Eleanor sat on the blackened earth among the remains of her western tree rows and looked at what was left. 40% of the west side was destroyed, burned down to black stumps that still smoked in the evening air. Others were scorched so badly that bark had peeled away in strips, exposing raw wood that looked like flesh beneath torn skin. 2 years of work, 2 seasons of planning and planting and wrapping and watering and hoping, converted to carbon and ash in a single afternoon. Gunnar sat beside her on the scorched ground. He uncapped his canteen and held it out. Eleanor took it with hands she could barely close, because the burns had begun to swell, tightening the skin across her palms, until every finger felt locked in position, curled around the shape of a tool handle that was no longer there. She drank. Then she folded forward over her knees and cried with a sound she did not recognize as her own. A low, broken keening that came from somewhere below. Thought, below language, below everything she had built on top of the raw fact of being alive and alone on this land. Gunnar did not touch her. He sat on the scorched earth beside her and waited until the sound had run its course, and then he spoke with the plain efficiency of a man who understands that in certain moments the only useful words are inventories. The east rows are fine, the house is fine, Runa is fine. He paused. You're alive. Eleanor did not get out of bed for 5 days. It was not rest. Rest implies a choice to pause a decision made from strength. This was collapse total and involuntary, a withdrawal so complete that the boundary between sleep and waking dissolved, and the hours blurred together into a gray continuum punctuated only by the throbbing in her hands. The bandages she had wrapped around them in the first hour grew stiff with seepage and needed changing, and she did not change them. Gunnar came each morning to feed the animals and check the surviving trees, performing these tasks without knocking or requiring acknowledgement. His boots on the porch and the barn door opening and closing, the only evidence that the world outside the bedroom still existed and still required maintenance. On the 3rd day, she picked up Thomas's notebook from the nightstand and held it for a moment, and then hurled it across the room with a force that came from somewhere deeper than muscle. This was your dream. The words tore from her throat raw and ragged, and aimed at the empty room and the man who was not in it. Not mine. You don't have to live with it. You don't have to carry it. You got to die and leave it to me, and I have to carry it alone. The notebook hit the wall and fell to the floor with its pages splayed open like the wings of a wounded bird. She could see Thomas's handwriting from across the room, the careful slanted letters, but could not read the words. She did not pick it up. On the fourth day, she looked at it from the bed. It lay where it had fallen open, and patient, making no demands. On the fifth day, she walked across the room and knelt on the floor, and picked it up, and smoothed the creased pages with fingers that were clumsy and thick with burns. The page that had fallen open was the last one, the one with Thomas's final entry. She read the words again now with eyes that had seen fire, and hands that had fought it, and the words were the same, but she was not. And the distance between the woman who had first read them in October and the woman reading them now in the ashes of July was the distance between theory and experience, between imagining pain and knowing it by name. She closed the notebook. She stood up. She put on her boots and walked outside into a morning that smelled of ash and distance and the first faint suggestion of autumn, arriving early to survey the damage summer had done. The surviving trees on the east side stood green and upright against the sky, and the burned stumps on the west side stood black and broken against the same sky. Both of these things were true at the same time. Neither cancelled the other. The farm contained both salvation and ruin, and she was the woman standing in the space between them, and the space between them was her life. She picked up her spade. That same afternoon, Silas Pemberton drove up with a leather folder on the seat beside him. He stepped down from the wagon and surveyed the damage with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, but contained satisfaction within it the way a house contains rooms that guests are not meant to see. $700 for the property, more than generous given the circumstances. The charred stumps, the bandaged hands, another winter 8 weeks away. The paperwork was ready, one signature, and the story was over. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread before her. The pen was in her hand. The bandages on her fingers made it difficult to grip. She read the transfer document, the legal language that would convert everything she had fought for into a number followed by a dollar sign, and the number was fair, and the dollar sign was real, and the pain in her hands was real, and the winter coming was real, and the logic of surrender had never been more persuasive than it was at this moment. Sitting in the kitchen, Thomas built with the smell of ash still in her hair. The pen touched the paper, a single point of contact between the instrument that would end this and the surface that would record it. Then she stopped. She was looking at her hands, not the papers, not the pen, not the window. Her hands wrapped in cotton-stained yellow with seepage swollen trembling, bearing the marks of every hole she had dug and every fire she had fought. Thomas had written about trees in a notebook. She had planted them in the ground with these hands. There was a distance between dreaming and doing, and the distance was measured in scars. "No, I will replant." Silas snatched the papers from the table. "You are out of your mind." His voice held no performance in it, no calculation. Only the raw bewilderment of a man confronting a stubbornness that exceeded his own, a refusal that operated on principles he could not access because they were denominated in a currency he did not trade in. He left without closing the door behind him, and the door swung open in the evening wind. And Eleanor sat at the table, looking through the open doorway at the burned ground and the standing trees beyond it. And the open door felt like a threshold she had crossed in the wrong direction, back into the cold and the uncertainty and the work, and she had crossed it with her eyes open and her hands ruined, and no guarantee of anything except that tomorrow she would dig. She ordered new saplings through Orin. She replanted with bandaged hands that bled through the cotton before noon. Each day the blood mixing with the dark soil until she could not tell where her body ended and the earth began. Gunnar came every afternoon digging without conversation, a silent partnership that required no contract and no explanation, and produced no sound except the rhythmic bite of metal into ground. 3 weeks after the fire, on an evening when the first cool breath of September had begun to creep into the air, the two of them stood at the edge of the new West Row and looked at what they had done, 40 fresh saplings standing in holes that were still raw, their roots packed in soil that was still loose, their survival as uncertain as anything Eleanor had ever wagered on. 3 weeks after the fire, on an evening when the smell of ash had finally begun to fade from the soil, Eleanor answered a knock at her door and found Alma Pemberton standing on the porch. She was a small woman, narrow in the shoulders, with hands that she clasped in front of her body, the way people do when they are holding themselves together from the outside, because the inside has already come apart. Her eyes were red but dry, the evidence of tears that had been spent somewhere else on the road perhaps, or in the barn before she climbed onto the buggy seat and drove here in the last light of day. "It was me." The words came before Eleanor could speak, before the door was fully open, before any of the ordinary courtesies that people use to delay the thing they came to say. "The basket, the bread, all winter. Please don't tell Silas." Eleanor brought her inside. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and Alma's story came out in pieces the way confessions do when they have been carried too long and have grown into the body that holds them. She had baked the bread in the early morning hours while Silas slept, rising at 3 to mix dough and heat the oven, and work in silence so complete that the sound of her own breathing seemed dangerous. She had driven the buggy in darkness through temperatures that cracked the leather of the reins and froze the moisture in her nostrils into needles of ice because she could not bear the thought of a woman alone in the cold while her husband calculated the profit margin on that woman's despair. Eleanor's question was simple. Why? Alma looked at her hands, still clasped, still holding. "Because I know what it is to be alone even when you're not. Because Silas wasn't always like this. Before the investment failed in '88, before we lost everything and had to start over in a town that smelled like cattle and dust, he was decent, patient. He used to read to me in the evenings." She paused, and the pause was the shape of a marriage compressed into silence. "Now he's afraid. Afraid of being poor again. Afraid of anything he can't control. And fear made him into something I don't always recognize." She raised her eyes and met Eleanor's. And what passed between them was not sympathy but identification. The wordless acknowledgement of two women who had each lived inside a version of the same architecture, a house where their presence was required and their voice was optional. "And because what you're doing with those trees is the bravest thing I've ever watched anyone do." Then Alma's face changed. The softness contracted into something harder and more urgent, and her voice dropped to the register people use when they are delivering information that will alter the shape of the conversation and possibly the shape of a life. "But there's something else you need to know. Silas is filing a petition with the county court. He's going to use the overdue debt to request a court-ordered auction of your property. He knows that in the middle of winter, with no competing buyers, the land will sell for a fraction of its value, and he'll be the only man at the auction with cash in his hand." She paused. "The hearing is set for October. He has Judge Osmond who owes him favors going back years." Eleanor received this information the way she had received the blizzard and the fire, with a stillness that was not calm, but was something more functional than calm. A narrowing, a locking down of everything inessential, so that only the machinery required for immediate survival continued to operate. "Thank you, Alma." Two words that carried the weight of bread in a basket and rope on a frozen porch, and the particular courage required to betray a husband's secrets for the sake of a stranger's survival. The question of the payment consumed Eleanor's waking hours in the weeks between Alma's visit and the hearing. The wheat harvest was gutted. Drought had stunted what the fire had not reached, and the $30 she had saved would not cover even the first installment. She spent 3 days in the barn with Runa, running her hands along the mare's neck and speaking to her in the low, steady voice she used when a decision was too heavy to carry silently. On the fourth morning, She walked to Gunnar Dahl's fence line and waited until he came out. She needed to sell 2 of her 4 remaining cattle. Gunnar knew every buyer within 50 miles. She could not afford sentiment, and she could not afford to wait. Gunnar looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measures not the request, but the cost of making it. And then he nodded once. By the end of the week, he had found a buyer in a town 12 miles east, a rancher expanding his herd before winter, and the price was fair, $80. Combined with her 30 from wheat, she had enough for the first 2 installments and a margin thin enough to see through. The hearing was held on the 14th of October in the single room at the back of the Millerville land office that served as the county court. Pine benches scarred by decades of boots and belt buckles. A judge's table that was really a clerk's desk with a flag thumbtacked to the wall behind it. The room was full. Every farmer within riding distance had come not out of solidarity with either party, but out of the human appetite for reckoning, the need to witness the moment when competing claims collide and one of them breaks. Silas Pemberton sat at the front with his leather folder, and the composure of a man who has rehearsed the final scene so many times that he has confused preparation with inevitability. Beside the judge's table, Vivian Hartwell sat with a lawyer from St. Paul, a thin man with a thin briefcase whose presence announced that the claim to divide Thomas's estate had survived the winter and arrived at this room intact and bearing legal weight. Eleanor faced 2 fronts simultaneously, a creditor to her left and a claimant to her right, and between them sat Judge Osmond, 60 years old, arranging his papers with the fastidious precision of a man who believed in procedure the way other men believed in God absolutely, and without accommodation for exceptions. Eleanor stood alone. No lawyer, no advocate, no one at the table beside her except the ghost of a man who had dreamed of trees and lacked the nerve to plant them. She did not deny the debt. She presented the promissory note and confirmed Thomas's signature and the amount outstanding, and the fact that the June deadline had passed without payment. She offered no excuses because excuses were a currency that had no value in this room. Then she made her case. She would repay the full $200 in installments over 18 months from wheat revenue and livestock sales. She placed $80 on the judge's table cash she had earned from the cattle sale as evidence of her capacity and her intent. She presented Orrin Munsell's written assessment of the windbreak's projected impact on crop yields and soil retention and livestock survival rates. And she placed Thomas's notebook on the judge's table open to the planting diagram. "My husband planned this, Your Honor. He researched it and drew every detail and never did it because he was afraid of what people would say. I did it. The tree survived 40 below. They survived fire. They will survive whatever comes next, and so will I. The debt is real, and I will honor it. But this land is not for sale, and it is not for auction." Osmond studied the notebook for a long time, long enough that the room grew quiet in the particular way rooms grow quiet when the people in them realize that the thing they came to watch has become the thing they will remember. He examined the $80 on the table. He read Orrin's assessment. He looked at Eleanor's bandaged hands and her unmarked face, and the way she stood without leaning on anything, without shifting her weight, without any of the small physical negotiations that people make when they are uncertain of the ground beneath them. Then Vivian stood. The room shifted. Every head turned. The lawyer beside her reached for her arm, and she moved it away from him with a motion that was small and final. "I withdraw my claim." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. "That is my brother's handwriting. I recognize it." She sat down without elaboration, without looking at Eleanor, without looking at anyone. And the lawyer beside her closed his thin briefcase with a sound like a book being shut for the last time. Osmond ruled at noon. The $80 would be applied immediately to the outstanding balance, the remainder to be repaid in installments over 18 months. property to remain in Eleanor's name pending completion of all payments. But if any single installment was missed, Silas Pemberton could petition immediately for court-ordered sale. The condition hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread, and Eleanor understood that she had won the battle and inherited the siege. Silas gathered his folder and walked out without looking at anyone. Outside on the steps, Orrin took Eleanor's hand with a gentleness that acknowledged the bandages and the burns beneath them. "You just won something harder than any winter in Dakota." Eleanor walked home through an October afternoon that smelled of fallen leaves and cold earth. She had won, but the second winter was already tightening its grip, and her replanted West rows were young and fragile, and would face the cold without the year of growth they should have had. She counted the remaining installments in her head, matching each one against projected harvest and the dwindling livestock she could still sell if the ground failed her again. The arithmetic was tight. It left no room for catastrophe, and the prairie had never been a place that respected margins. The second winter tested the young trees and found them willing. Eleanor paid the second installment in January from the sale of stored grain, walking the money into Millerville herself, because she wanted the transaction to occur in the physical space between her body and Silas's, where it could not be denied or reinterpreted. He took the payment and recorded it in his ledger, and said nothing. And the nothing he said was louder than anything he could have spoken. The third and fourth installments followed through the spring and summer of 1894, each one carved from a harvest that was modest but sufficient, each one delivered in person, each one received in the same loaded silence. The third spring arrived in late April of 1895 and announced itself not with warmth or color, but with a single sound that Eleanor heard through the kitchen window while her coffee steamed in her hands. Birdsong. A cardinal on the lowest branch of the red cedar nearest the house, its feathers so vivid against the dark needles that it looked like a drop of blood on a surgeon's cloth. It tilted its head and opened its beak and sang a clear liquid phrase repeated 3 times, and Eleanor realized she had never heard birdsong on this property. Not once in 8 years. The prairie had always been wind and grass and silence, and birds had never lingered, because there had been nothing for them to linger on, no branch to perch on, no canopy to shelter beneath, no reason to stay. The cardinal had a reason now. She opened the kitchen door and stepped onto the porch. The trees along the north and east rows stood 10 feet tall, their canopies beginning to touch and merge into a continuous green wall. The replanted west rows were shorter, but vigorous, thick enough to bend the wind around the house like water around a stone. Eleanor drank her coffee, and the coffee stayed hot to the last sip, because the air around the house was sheltered, fundamentally altered from the air 50 yards beyond the tree line. She could feel it in the way her hair lay flat against her neck. She could see it in the garden soil holding moisture into mid-morning. She could hear it in the absence that defined everything. The constant grinding moan of unobstructed wind, replaced by something layered and alive with the small sounds of creatures that had found a place worth inhabiting. By the summer of 1895, Eleanor had completed every installment of the debt. She walked the final payment into Millerville on a Tuesday morning in June 3 years to the month after the original due date, and placed the bills on the counter of Silas Pemberton's store. He counted them without speaking. He opened his ledger, drew a line through the entry, and wrote the word "settled" in the margin. Then he looked up, and what Eleanor saw in his face was not the defeat she had expected, but something more complicated and less satisfying. Exhaustion. The particular tiredness of a man who has spent 3 years pushing against something that would not move and has finally stopped pushing, not because he has been convinced, but because he has been outlasted. He reached beneath the counter and produced the original promissory note and placed it in Eleanor's hand. The paper was warm from being stored near the stove. Eleanor folded it once and put it in her pocket and walked out into the June sunlight and stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed. and the breath she drew was different from every breath she had taken for 3 years. Because it did not carry the weight of a number attached to a deadline, attached to the threat of losing everything. The debt was gone. The land was hers. The trees were growing, and the air in her lungs tasted like the beginning of something rather than the middle of a fight. November of 1895 brought illness. She woke with a pain in her chest that deepened by noon into something structural, a cough that produced rust-colored discharge, a fever that alternated between burning and freezing in cycles that left the sheets soaked and her body convulsing. Pneumonia, the disease that killed more settlers on the plains than cold or starvation or loneliness combined. For 3 days, Eleanor lay in bed while her body fought a war she could not participate in. The fever brought dreams that were indistinguishable from waking. Thomas standing among the trees, not as he had been in life, but as he existed now in memory, a figure composed of gestures and silences, and the particular way he held his shoulders when he was thinking about something he would never say. He stood in dappled shade and smiled and raised his hand and beckoned, and she tried to go to him. But the distance between them did not decrease no matter how she strained against the fever's hold. And when the coughing came, it erased him and left her in a dark room with the wind against the walls, and no certainty that morning would bring anything different from night. Gunnar appeared each morning without being summoned, feeding the livestock and checking every tree in the north row, packing soil around a leaning cedar that Frostheave had loosened during the night. Alma arrived on the second afternoon with broth and herbs, steeped into a tea so bitter that Eleanor's eyes watered. But she drank it because Alma told her to, and because she had learned that Alma's quiet authority operated on a frequency that did not require debate. Hazel Soren, a young woman of 30 from a claim 4 miles north with 3 small children and eyes rimmed red from wind or weeping, or both, rode over to check the east rows because someone in town had mentioned that the Hartwell woman was down and the trees might need watching. When Eleanor recovered on the 5th day hollow and diminished and 20 pounds lighter, she stepped onto the porch and found Gunnar retying a support frame. He straightened when he heard the door. About time. I was running out of excuses to avoid my own chores. But 3 trees on the north row had died. Their roots, exposed by frost heaved during the nights when no one had known to wrap them, had frozen and split open, and the trees stood among their living neighbors, like gaps in a sentence that changed its meaning. Eleanor looked at the 3 dead trunks and felt a grief that was different from any she had carried before. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of limitation. She had built this thing by the force of her own will and the labor of her own hands, and she had believed somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the pride that her will and her hands were sufficient. They were not. They had never been. The trees had survived the blizzard and the fire and the courtroom and 3 years of wind because Eleanor had fought for them. But they had also survived because Gunnar had dug holes without being asked, because Alma had brought bread in the killing dark, because Orin had lent books and measured trunks and written assessments that carried the weight of science. The trees were not hers alone. They had not been hers alone since the first winter, when a stranger's bread on a frozen porch had kept her mind from folding inward upon itself. She had simply been too consumed by the work to notice the moment when ownership had become something shared. Gunnar drove a stake into the ground beside the first dead trunk, marking it for replacement. His voice carried the rough gentleness of a man stating something he considers obvious. Not your trees anymore, Eleanor. They belong to all of us now. She leaned against the porch rail and watched him work and understood that he was right, and that being right did not diminish what she had done, but enlarged it, transformed a private act of survival into something communal, an inheritance that would outlast any single pair of hands or any single woman's stubbornness. The autumn of 1895 brought Vivian back. Eleanor saw immediately that something fundamental had changed. The city clothes were gone, replaced by a plain wool dress and a coat that had seen better days and had stopped pretending otherwise. The defiance that had armored her during their last encounter had been stripped away by whatever years had done to her in St. Paul, leaving something unprotected and uncertain in its place, the face of a woman who has exhausted every alternative and arrived at the last door she knows how to knock on. They sat on the porch because the weather was mild enough, and because the porch, surrounded by trees that had not existed when Vivian had last stood on this property, was the right place for what needed to be said. I came to apologize. After Thomas died, I was frightened. He was the only person in the family who still cared about me. I thought if I could get money from the land, I could make myself safe. I didn't think about what the land meant to you. I didn't think about what Thomas would have wanted. I thought only about myself, and I am ashamed of it. Eleanor had rehearsed this conversation many times over 2 years, and in every rehearsal she had been righteous and cold and armored, in the satisfaction of having been right. But sitting here now with the branches overhead filtering the October light into something soft and dappled, the righteousness had drained away, and left behind only a recognition tired and without edges that fear made people do terrible things, and that Vivian's fear was a sister to her own. This land was never your security, Vivian. But Thomas was your brother, and that makes you family. If you need a place to winter, my door is open. Vivian bent forward on the porch step and covered her face with her hands, and the sound she made was private and small, belonging to no audience, the sound of someone releasing something they had been gripping so tightly that their fingers had cramped around the shape of it and forgotten how to open. Eleanor put her hand on Vivian's back, and they sat together while the light moved through the branches and the cardinal sang somewhere in the cedar row, and the first cool evening of autumn settled over the prairie like a hand laid gently on a feverish forehead. In January of 1896, on a morning when frost had transformed every surface into a landscape of crystal, Silas Pemberton's wagon pulled up, and Eleanor walked out to meet it. The man on the wagon seat was not the man she had faced across kitchen tables and courtrooms. His shoulders had lost their aggressive set. His chin was lower. His hands held the reins loosely without the white-knuckled grip of a man controlling something. And the absence of that grip was itself a kind of statement. Alma won't let me hear the end of it until we plant trees of our own. I came to ask where I should start. Eleanor looked at this man. The man who had waved a promissory note across her kitchen table 1 week after Thomas's body was in the ground. The man who had called her trees dead sticks. The man who had dragged her into a courtroom and tried to take everything she had. And behind that man, invisible but as present as the winter air between them, was Alma, who had driven through killing cold to leave bread on a stranger's porch. Because the distance between what her husband was doing and what she could live with had become unbridgeable by any means except flour and yeast and the courage to act alone. See Orrin Munsell in town. He can get you what you need, and if you want advice on placement and timing, you know where to find me. Silas nodded. He turned his wagon. He left. Eleanor stood in the cold and watched the wheel tracks harden in the frozen mud, and felt something she did not expect and could not have manufactured. Not triumph, not satisfaction. A tenderness so deep it ached, aimed at the bewildering complexity of a man who had been cruel because he was frightened, and who was now sitting on her porch because his wife had worn down his pride the way water wears down stone, not by force but by persistence, and by the quiet refusal to pretend that what was happening was acceptable. She went inside and opened Thomas's notebook to the planting diagram, and in the margin in her own hand wrote 2 words, "It's working." Then she sat in the kitchen and felt the fighting ease not end, but ease the way a clenched fist slowly opens when the thing it was gripping has been set down. Forgiveness, she discovered, was not a decision, but a sensation. The releasing of a tension she had mistaken for bone. Bertha Holgrim arrived one afternoon in the autumn of 1896 and stood in Eleanor's garden among tomatoes that would not have survived a single week on this property 4 years earlier. Her face carried the particular honesty of a woman who has held out longer than everyone around her and is tired of the solitude of the last position. Enoch and I have decided to plant trees. We are the last family in the county that hasn't, and I am tired of being the last at anything. It was not the most noble reason to plant trees, but Eleanor had learned over hard years that reasons mattered less than roots, and a tree planted out of embarrassment grew just as tall as a tree planted out of conviction. Hazel Soren came to the porch that same autumn with her hat in her hands. The wind at our place blows all night, and my youngest daughter cries and asks me why it's so angry. Someone in town told me you know how to make it stop. Eleanor looked at Hazel and saw herself in the autumn of 1892 standing in Orrin's office with a hand-drawn map and a dead husband's notebook, and nothing else but the refusal to die quietly. She invited Hazel inside and poured coffee and sat across from her and did something she had never done before. She told the whole story. Thomas's death, the notebook, Silas's offers, the first winter, the fire, the 5 days in bed, the courtroom, Alma's secret baskets. Every piece of the jagged, complicated truth, because Hazel needed to hear not just the method, but the cost. And not just the cost, but the evidence that the cost could be borne by a woman no stronger and no braver than herself. My husband drew this plan but never had the courage to follow it. I followed it for both of us. Now I will help you draw one for your land. They worked for 2 hours, sketching the property from memory, marking positions, calculating distances. When Hazel left, she carried a list of species and a planting schedule, and something weightless that was worth more than either. The knowledge that the woman who had accomplished this impossible thing had also been afraid, had also wanted to quit, had also lain in bed and stared at the ceiling and wondered whether any of it was worth the wreckage of her hands. Clement Kettlewell, a young journalist from Fargo, arrived in the summer of 1897 with a camera that required a tripod and 3 minutes of stillness. He photographed the tree rows from multiple angles. He photographed Eleanor, standing beside the tallest cottonwood, her hand on the bark, the trunk now too thick for her fingers to reach around. He sat on the porch step with a notebook and asked her to explain what she had done and why. It was not just planting trees. It was learning to read this place instead of trying to rewrite it. The wind has been here longer than any of us. I did not stop it. I just gave it something to move through instead of something to move against. The article ran in the Fargo Forum with 2 photographs. Copies reached agricultural offices in Bismarck and St. Paul, and eventually a desk in Washington, where someone circled it in red ink and wrote a note requesting further investigation. Dr. Garfield Halloway, a botanist from the University of Nebraska, came in the spring of 1898 and spent 2 hours walking the rows with a measuring tape recording heights and trunk diameters, and canopy spread with the methodical patience of a man who builds understanding from small, precise observations accumulated over time. He sat on the porch and told Eleanor that what she had accomplished was extraordinary by any scientific standard, and that he wanted to document her work for the Department of Agriculture. I would appreciate it, Dr. Halloway, if you would note in your study that the original idea belonged to my husband, Thomas Hartwell. He planned these trees. He researched every species and drew every diagram. I was only the one who put them in the ground. Halloway inclined his head. I will make sure he's credited, Mrs. Hartwell. But permit me to observe that there is a considerable distance between planning and planting, and that the person who crosses that distance deserves recognition for the crossing. Eleanor accepted this without argument because she knew he was right. Thomas had dreamed. She had done. Both mattered, but they were not the same, and the difference between them was the difference between a map and a journey, between a seed held in the hand and a tree that casts its shadow on the ground. October of 1900, 8 years since the first stake. Eleanor sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and Thomas's notebook on her lap. The leather cover was worn soft now, darkened to the color of rich soil by years of handling. The spine was cracked from repeated opening. She turned to the planting diagram, the page she had looked at more than any other, and then she looked up. The trees were taller than the house. Their trunks were thick enough that she could no longer wrap her hands around them. Their canopies spread and intersected overhead, forming a continuous living architecture that changed the light and the sound and the very nature of the air within its boundaries. Silas Pemberton had planted his own windbreak 2 years prior and had become an advocate for Prairie forestation with the same relentless energy he had once directed at acquiring Eleanor's land. Alma came to the porch for tea on Thursday afternoons, and they sat together under the trees and talked about ordinary things, and neither of them ever mentioned the baskets of bread, because some debts are settled not by repayment, but by the quiet continuation of a friendship that requires no accounting. Gunnar had expanded his tree rows into a small forest that sheltered his fields, and his wheat yields had increased by a measure he described to anyone who would listen as substantial, which from Gunnar was equivalent to weeping with joy. Orrin counted more than 50 farms within 100 miles that had adopted windbreaks modeled on Eleanor's design. Hazel Soren wrote letters each month, and the most recent one sat on the kitchen table beside the notebook. Eleanor had read it 3 times. The trees were 5 feet tall. The youngest daughter had stopped asking why the wind was angry. And at the bottom of the letter in handwriting that slanted to the right the way Eleanor's own did, Hazel had written, "She told me last night that the trees are singing. I didn't correct her because I think she might be right." Eleanor closed the notebook and held it against her chest. The cardinal was singing in the cedar row, and its offspring were scattered through the trees. Red notes in a green composition that had not existed 3 years ago, and that would continue to elaborate itself for decades to come. Somewhere in Washington, Kettlewell's article sat in a file that would contribute to policies affecting millions of acres. Somewhere in Bismarck, Orrin was preparing a report that used the word windbreak 47 times. Somewhere on 50 farms across the Dakota prairie trees that owed their existence to a leather notebook, and a woman with burned hands were growing taller in soil that was learning season by season how to hold on to its own moisture. But the story that mattered most to Eleanor was simpler than all of that. It was the story of a woman who had lost her husband and found his dream in a locked drawer, and had carried that dream out of the house and into the ground, where it had taken root and grown into something that sheltered not just her, but everyone around her. It was the story of hands that had dug and planted and burned and healed and kept working. It was the story of a notebook passed from a man who dreamed to a woman who did, and of the distance between those two things, which is the distance between a seed and a tree, which is the distance that only time and stubbornness and love can cross. She sat on the porch until the stars came out thick and bright above the dark canopy. The coffee grew cold in her cup. The wind moved through her trees and made a sound that was neither voice nor music, but contained elements of both a long rolling whisper that traveled through the canopy from west to east and then passed on into the open prairie beyond, carrying with it the smell of cedar and cottonwood and the accumulated warmth of the sheltered ground beneath. And from inside the house, if anyone had been listening, they would have heard nothing at all, because the woman who lived there was sitting in silence, and the silence was not empty. It was full of birdsong remembered, and debt repaid, and bread baked in the dark, and a daughter who believed the trees were singing. Full of the particular contentment that belongs to a person who has built something that will stand after they are gone, something that did not exist before they arrived and will not disappear when they leave. Something that began as a drawing in a dead man's notebook and became a forest that broke the wind and sheltered the living and sang to the children of strangers. Eleanor Hartwell, who had been told she would not survive, sat in the center of the impossible thing she had built. The wind whispered, the stars burned, and she was content.